Sarah Chen had always been underestimated. At 5 feet 4 inches and weighing barely 120 pounds, she looked more like a college student than someone who had spent the last 8 years in the most classified corners of military intelligence. Her appearance was her greatest asset and her most frustrating burden. Tonight, as she stood in the marble-floored ballroom of the Meridian Hotel in Washington, D.C., she felt the familiar weight of dismissive glances from the crowd of military elites surrounding her. The annual Defense Intelligence Summit brought together the most decorated officers, seasoned operatives, and rising stars from every branch of the military. Sarah had earned her invitation through a combination of exceptional performance in psychological operations and her unique ability to extract information from targets who never saw her coming. But, looking around the room filled with broad-shouldered men in dress uniforms adorned with ribbons and medals, she felt like an imposter wearing a borrowed black evening dress. The chandeliers cast warm light across faces she recognized from classified briefings. Admirals, generals, and Special Forces commanders mingled with champagne glasses, their conversations a mixture of war stories and political maneuvering. Sarah nursed her sparkling water and observed, a skill that had kept her alive in places where American operatives weren't supposed to exist. Commander Jake Morrison spotted her from across the room before she noticed him approaching. He was everything the military recruiting posters promised, 6 feet 2 inches of muscle wrapped in a navy dress uniform that showcased his seal trident pinned prominently on his chest. His square jaw and piercing blue eyes had made him something of a celebrity within special operations circles, and his recent promotion to lead a new counter-terrorism unit had elevated his status even further. Morrison had heard whispers about the mysterious operative known only as Phoenix in classified reports. The legend spoke of impossible extractions, interrogations that broke hardened terrorists, and missions accomplished with zero collateral damage. What he hadn't expected was for Phoenix to be a petite Asian woman who looked like she belonged in a university lecture hall rather than a war zone. His approach was calculated, the kind of confident stride that had intimidated enemies and impressed superiors throughout his 15-year career. Sarah watched him coming through her peripheral vision while maintaining a conversation with a CIA analyst about weather patterns in the Middle East. She had learned long ago to track multiple conversations simultaneously, a skill that had saved her life more times than she could count. Morrison interrupted their discussion with the kind of smile that had charmed senators and foreign diplomats. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience from subordinates. The CIA analyst, recognizing the social dynamics at play, excused himself with a knowing look that suggested he had witnessed similar encounters before. The conversation began pleasantly enough. Morrison complimented Sarah on her dress, asked about her background, and shared carefully edited versions of his own exploits in Afghanistan and Iraq. Sarah responded with practiced politeness, revealing nothing substantial about herself while encouraging him to continue talking. It was a technique she had perfected during countless operations: let the target feel dominant while gathering intelligence about their psychology and motivations. As the champagne flowed and Morrison's confidence grew, his questions became more pointed and his assumptions more insulting. He wondered aloud how someone so small could possibly contribute to serious military operations. Perhaps she worked in communications or intelligence analysis, safely removed from actual danger. The tone of his voice suggested he was doing her a favor by showing interest in what he assumed was a mundane career. Sarah maintained her pleasant expression while mentally cataloging everything about Morrison that would be useful in a physical confrontation. His stance favored his right side, suggesting an old injury to his left knee. His hand movements revealed he was right-handed, and the slight bulge under his left armpit indicated he carried a concealed weapon despite the formal setting. Most importantly, his body language screamed overconfidence and a fundamental inability to perceive her as a genuine threat. The turning point came when Morrison made a comment about how women in the military should focus on support roles rather than trying to prove themselves in combat situations. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah felt the familiar calm that descended over her in moments of impending violence. It was the same feeling she had experienced in a Syrian safe house when her cover was blown, or in a Moscow hotel room when Russian intelligence had finally tracked her down. Morrison seemed to interpret her silence as submission or perhaps hurt feelings. He moved closer, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a seductive whisper. His hand reached out to touch her arm in a gesture that was meant to seem comforting but, felt possessive and condescending. Sarah allowed the contact while calculating distances and angles, her mind automatically running through the dozens of ways she could end the confrontation before it properly began. The crowd around them continued their conversations, oblivious to the tension building between the decorated seal and the woman he had completely misjudged. Sarah caught glimpses of familiar faces in her peripheral vision: the deputy director of the CIA, a three-star general from Special Operations Command, and various other officials whose signatures appeared on the most sensitive documents in the intelligence community. Morrison's confidence reached its peak when he suggested they continue their conversation somewhere more private. His assumption that she would be flattered by his attention revealed everything Sarah needed to know about his character and capabilities. She had encountered his type before in military circles, men whose achievements in conventional warfare had convinced them they were unstoppable in every situation. The crowd began to quiet as something in the atmosphere shifted. Perhaps it was the way Sarah's posture changed almost imperceptibly, or maybe Morrison's voice had carried further than he intended. Whatever the cause, nearby conversations paused as attention began to focus on their interaction. Sarah was aware of the scrutiny without letting it affect her calculations. She had performed under observation before, though rarely with such a distinguished audience. Morrison made his fatal mistake when he misread her stillness as intimidation. His hand moved from her arm to her shoulder, and his voice took on the commanding tone he used with subordinates who needed to be reminded of their place in the hierarchy. The words he chose revealed his complete failure to understand who he was dealing with, and Sarah felt the last of her patience evaporate like morning mist under desert sun. The moment stretched between them, full of possibilities that Morrison couldn't see and consequences he couldn't imagine. Around them, the cream of American military intelligence continued their evening of networking and celebration, unaware that they were about to witness a demonstration that would be discussed in classified briefings for years to come. Sarah's response would not only humble one of the Navy's most celebrated operators but also serve as a reminder that the most dangerous people in their profession were often the ones no one suspected. Morrison's grip on Sarah's shoulder tightened as he leaned closer, his breath carrying the scent of expensive whiskey and misplaced confidence. His words came out in a low growl that he probably thought was intimidating. He suggested that someone like her needed to learn respect for those who had earned their place through blood and sacrifice. The implication was clear: she was an interloper in his world, and he was prepared to teach her the natural order of things. Sarah's response was not what he expected. Instead of backing down or showing the fear he anticipated, she smiled. It was not the nervous smile of someone trying to defuse a tense situation, but something far more dangerous. It was the smile of a predator who had finally been given permission to reveal her true nature. Morrison, despite all his training and combat experience, missed the warning entirely. The conversation around them had quieted significantly. Admiral Patricia Hayes, one of the few women to achieve flag rank in the Navy, watched with interest from 10 feet away. She recognized Sarah from classified briefings about operations that officially never happened. General Marcus Thompson from Joint Special Operations Command stood near the bar, his attention drawn by the familiar tension that preceded violence. These were people who had seen combat in every corner of the globe, and they sensed something was about to happen. Morrison's next words sealed his fate. He suggested that perhaps Sarah would benefit from some private instruction in how things worked in the real military. His hand moved from her shoulder toward her face in a gesture that was meant to be dominant and humiliating. It was the kind of move that had probably worked on civilian women who were impressed by his uniform and reputation. Sarah's response was instantaneous and devastating. Years of training in multiple martial arts, countless hours perfecting techniques that could disable larger opponents, and real-world experience against enemies who would show no mercy converged in a moment of perfect execution. Morrison never saw it coming. Her left hand intercepted his reaching arm with surgical precision, her fingers finding the pressure point on his wrist that would send shooting pain up to his shoulder. Simultaneously, her right hand drove upward in a strike that targeted his solar plexus with exactly the right amount of force to disrupt his breathing without causing permanent damage. The movement was so smooth and economical that observers later described it as looking like an elaborate dance move rather than a combat technique. Morrison's eyes widened in shock and pain as his body betrayed him. The breath rushed out of his lungs, and his knees began to buckle. But Sarah wasn't finished. Her left leg swept behind his right ankle while her hands guided his falling body toward the marble floor. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds from beginning to end. The sound of Morrison hitting the floor echoed through the suddenly silent ballroom. 250 of the most elite military professionals in the United States watched as their celebrated SEAL commander found himself flat on his back, staring up at the woman he had so dramatically underestimated. His dress uniform was disheveled, his breath came in ragged gasps, and his face showed the kind of confusion that comes from having one's entire worldview shattered in an instant. Sarah stood over him, her evening dress perfectly arranged and not a single hair out of place. Her breathing remained calm and controlled, as if she had just finished a pleasant conversation rather than dismantling one of the Navy's most decorated warriors. The transformation was remarkable. The quiet, seemingly fragile woman had vanished, replaced by someone who radiated competence and controlled lethality. The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Then, Admiral Hayes began to clap. The sound cut through the tension like a gunshot, and, within moments, others joined in. General Thompson nodded approvingly while reaching for his phone to send what would undoubtedly be a very interesting message to his colleagues in the special operations community. Morrison struggled to sit up, his face red with embarrassment and confusion. He looked around the room at faces he recognized, searching for sympathy or support but finding only amused admiration for Sarah's demonstration. Some of the observers were barely containing their laughter, while others watched him with the clinical interest of professionals evaluating a failed tactical decision. Sarah extended her hand to help him up, the gesture both gracious and devastating in its implications. Morrison stared at her offered assistance for a moment before reluctantly accepting it. As she pulled him to his feet with surprising strength, she spoke for the first time since the confrontation began. Her voice was calm and professional, carrying no malice or triumph, which somehow made her words even more impactful. She suggested that perhaps he should reconsider his assumptions about who belonged in which roles within the military community. Her tone was the same one she might use to discuss the weather, but everyone within hearing understood they had just witnessed a masterclass in psychological warfare as much as physical combat. Morrison had been defeated not just physically but intellectually and socially, all in front of the people whose respect he valued most. The crowd began to disperse, conversations resuming with renewed energy as people processed what they had witnessed. Morrison found himself surrounded by colleagues who were suddenly very interested in discussing other topics, their body language clearly indicating that his stock had dropped considerably in their estimation. The woman who had just humiliated him was being approached by some of the most senior officials in the room, their expressions showing newfound respect and curiosity. Colonel James Rivera from Army Intelligence was the first to introduce himself to Sarah properly, using the kind of formal courtesy reserved for fellow professionals of demonstrated capability. Behind him, a line of others waited their turn to pay their respects to someone they were now seeing in an entirely different light. Morrison watched from across the room as his victim became the center of attention he had expected to command himself. The true genius of Sarah's response became apparent in the following minutes. She had not simply defended herself, she had done so in a way that showcased exactly the kind of skills and mindset that made her valuable to the intelligence community. Every person in that room was now wondering what other capabilities she possessed and how those skills might be useful for their own organizations and missions. Morrison made his way to the bar, trying to salvage what remained of his dignity while nursing both his bruised body and his wounded pride. The bartender, a retired Navy chief who had seen enough military politics to recognize a career-defining moment when he saw one, served him a double whiskey without being asked. Morrison accepted the drink with a rueful smile, beginning to understand that he had just learned a very expensive lesson about the dangers of making assumptions. As the evening progressed, the story of Morrison's encounter with Sarah spread through the room with the speed of military gossip. Each retelling seemed to add new details or emphasize different aspects of what had happened, but the core message remained constant. There were people in their community whose capabilities far exceeded what their appearance might suggest, and underestimating them was done at one's own peril. Sarah continued to circulate through the room, her conversation now focused on substantive discussions of strategy and operations rather than the polite small talk that had characterized her earlier interactions. The demonstration had eliminated any need for her to prove herself through words. her actions had spoken with a clarity that no amount of credentials or recommendations could have provided. Morrison found himself in the uncomfortable position of having become an object lesson in the very room where he had expected to enhance his reputation. However, as the initial shock wore off and his professional instincts reasserted themselves, he began to appreciate the elegance of what Sarah had accomplished. She had neutralized a threat, made her point, and done both without causing the kind of lasting damage that might have created serious problems for either of them. The aftermath of the confrontation revealed layers of complexity that Morrison had never imagined. As he nursed his wounded pride and his bruised ribs, conversations swirled around him that painted an entirely different picture of the woman he had so catastrophically misjudged. Admiral Hayes approached him with the kind of expression senior officers wore when they were about to deliver information that would fundamentally change someone's perspective on recent events. Sarah Chen, Hayes informed him quietly, was not simply another intelligence operative trying to network her way up the military hierarchy. She was the legendary Phoenix, whose operations had prevented 3 major terrorist attacks on American soil and whose intelligence gathering had led to the capture of dozens of high-value targets across 4 continents. The small woman Morrison had attempted to intimidate was personally responsible for saving thousands of lives through missions that would never be acknowledged publicly. The Admiral's words hit Morrison like a second physical blow. He had heard stories about Phoenix during classified briefings, whispered accounts of impossible missions accomplished through a combination of psychological manipulation and surgical violence. The operative had become something of a myth within special operations circles, with some questioning whether such a person actually existed or was simply a convenient cover story for classified technologies and collaborative international efforts. Hayes continued her impromptu briefing, describing operations that read like fiction but were documented in the most secure files of the intelligence community. There was the extraction of a British scientist from a Syrian prison that had required Phoenix to spend 6 months building a cover identity as a refugee relief worker. The mission had culminated in a nighttime operation that saw her eliminate 8 guards and extract the target without raising any alarm until morning. Then, there was the Moscow operation where Phoenix had infiltrated a Russian oligarch's private party and walked out with intelligence that revealed a massive money laundering operation funding terrorist organizations across Eastern Europe. The mission had required her to seduce a target, disable his security team, crack a sophisticated safe, and escape from a building surrounded by Russian intelligence officers who had been tracking her for months. Morrison listened with growing amazement and horror as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Each story Hayes shared revealed new dimensions of Sarah's capabilities and experience. She wasn't simply skilled in hand-to-hand combat, she was a master of psychological operations, surveillance, infiltration, and elimination. The woman who had just put him on his back in front of the entire intelligence community was quite possibly the most dangerous person in the room. But, perhaps the most unsettling revelation was learning about Sarah's background and motivation. Hayes explained that Phoenix had lost her entire family in a terrorist attack during college, an incident that had transformed her from a pre-med student into one of the most effective operatives the intelligence community had ever produced. Her small stature and unassuming appearance were not accidents of genetics but carefully maintained tools that allowed her to access targets and locations that would be impossible for more conventional operators. General Thompson joined their conversation, adding his own insights about Sarah's methods and achievements. He described her psychological profiles of enemy commanders that had proven so accurate they had fundamentally changed how the military approached counterterrorism strategy. Her ability to understand and predict human behavior had made her invaluable not just as an operative but as an analyst and strategist. The general shared details about an operation in Afghanistan where Sarah had spent 3 months living in a refugee camp, slowly building relationships with women who had access to Taliban leadership compounds. The intelligence she gathered had led to a series of targeted strikes that decimated the terrorist organization's command structure in that region. Her work had directly contributed to saving hundreds of coalition lives and accelerating the timeline for establishing security in contested areas. Morrison found himself reassessing every moment of their earlier interaction. What he had interpreted as nervousness or social awkwardness had actually been Sarah conducting her own intelligence-gathering operation. She had been analyzing his psychology, assessing his capabilities, and developing multiple response scenarios while he had been focused on his own assumptions and prejudices. The realization that she had been several steps ahead of him throughout their entire conversation was both humbling and terrifying. Morrison began to understand that from the moment Sarah had noticed his approach, she had been preparing for the possibility that he might become a threat requiring neutralization. His aggressive behavior had simply confirmed her assessment and triggered a response that was both measured and devastating. Other officers began sharing their own encounters with Phoenix, painting a picture of an operative who existed at the intersection of multiple disciplines and capabilities. Colonel Rivera described a joint operation where Sarah had successfully impersonated a wealthy arms dealer's daughter for 6 weeks, gathering intelligence that led to the exposure of a network supplying weapons to insurgent groups across Africa. Major Lisa Santos from Air Force Intelligence recounted a briefing where Sarah had predicted the movements of a terrorist cell with such precision that Special Forces units had been able to position themselves for perfect interdiction operations. Her psychological profiles had been so detailed that commanders knew not just where their targets would be, but what they would be thinking and how they would react to various tactical approaches. As these stories accumulated, Morrison began to appreciate the elegant precision of Sarah's response to his aggression. She had used exactly the amount of force necessary to neutralize the threat he represented while minimizing collateral damage to his career and reputation. A more violent response might have seriously injured him and created political complications. A less decisive response might have failed to make her point effectively. The psychology behind her choice of techniques also became clear. By using moves that appeared almost graceful, she had demonstrated superior skill without seeming unnecessarily brutal. By helping him up and speaking calmly afterward, she had shown both mercy and control. The entire sequence had been designed to teach rather than simply punish, though the lesson had been delivered with unmistakable authority. Morrison realized that Sarah could have ended the confrontation in dozens of different ways, many of which would have resulted in his hospitalization or worse. Her choice to use techniques that primarily focused on control and embarrassment rather than permanent damage revealed both professional restraint and a sophisticated understanding of the social and political dynamics at play in the room. The more he learned about Phoenix's background and capabilities, the more Morrison understood that his defeat had been inevitable from the moment he chose to approach her with hostile intentions. She had probably identified him as a potential threat before he had even decided to cross the room. His subsequent behavior had simply confirmed her assessment and provided justification for the response she had undoubtedly been planning since their conversation began. General Thompson pulled Morrison aside for a private conversation that would prove to be one of the most important of his military career. The general explained that Morrison's encounter with Sarah represented an opportunity rather than simply an embarrassment. The special operations community was always looking for people who could recognize and acknowledge their mistakes, learn from them, and adapt their approach accordingly. Thompson suggested that Morrison's response to being defeated by Sarah would determine how the incident affected his future prospects. He could either allow his ego to turn the experience into a source of resentment and self-pity, or he could treat it as valuable training that had taught him important lessons about assumptions, preparedness, and respect for fellow professionals regardless of their appearance. The general's words carried weight beyond their immediate context. Morrison understood that he was being evaluated not just on his reaction to being physically dominated, but on his ability to process new information and adjust his worldview accordingly. The intelligence community valued adaptability and humility above almost every other trait, and this moment would demonstrate whether he possessed those qualities. Morrison's path back across the ballroom towards Sarah required more courage than many of his combat missions. Every step was observed by colleagues who were undoubtedly wondering how the celebrated SEAL would handle his very public humiliation. The conversations he passed seemed to pause momentarily as people watched to see whether his ego would allow him to take the mature approach to his situation. Sarah noticed his approach while discussing advanced interrogation techniques with a group of CIA analysts. Her peripheral awareness was one of the skills that had kept her alive through operations in hostile territory, and she tracked Morrison's movement while maintaining her conversation about the psychological pressure points most effective against different personality types. When he finally reached speaking distance, she excused herself from the group with the kind of polite efficiency that suggested the timing was no coincidence. Morrison's opening words required careful consideration. Everything he said would be analyzed not just by Sarah but by the numerous observers who were pretending not to watch their interaction. His first attempt at an apology was clumsy and self-serving, focusing more on his embarrassment than on his behavior that had created the situation. Sarah listened with the same patient attention she had shown during their initial conversation, waiting for him to find his way to something more substantial. Her response was both gracious and educational. Sarah acknowledged that Morrison's reaction was understandable given the circumstances, but she also made it clear that his assumptions about her capabilities had been dangerous for both of them. In a different environment, his aggressive behavior might have triggered a response that would have resulted in serious injury or worse. The evening's outcome had been carefully calibrated to teach rather than destroy, but such restraint was not always possible or appropriate in her line of work. Morrison found himself genuinely curious about Sarah's background and training for the first time. His questions shifted from challenging her credentials to seeking to understand how someone with her appearance had developed such devastating capabilities. Sarah's answers revealed a journey that began with personal tragedy and had evolved through years of training that would have broken most people physically and psychologically. She described the first months of her transformation from college student to operative, when instructors had pushed her beyond every limit she thought she possessed. The physical conditioning had been brutal, but the psychological preparation had been even more challenging. Learning to suppress natural emotional responses, to observe and analyze rather than react, and to maintain cover identities that required her to become completely different people for months at a time. The conversation evolved into something resembling a mutual debriefing. Morrison shared his own experiences with the intense selection processes and training programs that had shaped his military career. He began to appreciate that while their paths had been different, they had both undergone transformations that had fundamentally changed who they were as people. The discipline required to excel in special operations created certain commonalities regardless of the specific branch or specialty. Sarah's insights into the psychology of combat proved particularly fascinating to Morrison. She explained how her small stature and feminine appearance had initially seemed like insurmountable disadvantages but had gradually become her greatest assets. Enemies consistently underestimated her, creating opportunities for surprise and tactical advantage that larger, more obviously dangerous operatives could never achieve. The strategic implications of her approach became clear as she described missions where her appearance had allowed her to access targets and gather intelligence in ways that would have been impossible for conventional operators. Her ability to blend into civilian populations, to appear harmless and unthreatening, had opened doors that would have remained closed to anyone who looked like they belonged in military or intelligence circles. Morrison realized that his encounter with Sarah had provided him with valuable insights that extended far beyond personal embarrassment. The assumptions he had made about her capabilities were the same kinds of mistakes that could prove fatal in actual combat situations. Enemy combatants who appeared weak or unthreatening might possess training and equipment that could neutralize even the most elite special forces operators. Their conversation attracted the attention of other attendees who had been waiting for an opportunity to approach Sarah without seeming to intrude on her discussion with Morrison. Admiral Hayes rejoined them, followed by several other senior officers who were clearly interested in learning more about Phoenix's methods and availability for future operations. Morrison found himself in the unexpected position of serving as an informal intermediary between Sarah and potential new assignments. His earlier defeat had given him a unique perspective on her capabilities, and his professional reputation meant that his endorsement of her skills carried weight with decision-makers who might otherwise be skeptical of claims about the diminutive operative's achievements. The evening's later conversations revealed ongoing operations and emerging threats that could benefit from Sarah's particular combination of skills. A terrorist organization had been recruiting operatives who could blend into academic environments, requiring counterintelligence efforts that would demand someone capable of maintaining a scholarly cover identity while conducting surveillance and potential elimination missions. Another situation involved an arms trafficking network that had been using wives and daughters of legitimate businessmen to transport weapons and intelligence across international borders. Traditional male operatives had proven ineffective against an organization that specifically targeted gender-based assumptions about who might represent a security threat. Morrison's military experience proved valuable in helping Sarah understand the tactical requirements and political constraints that would shape any potential operations. His knowledge of Special Forces capabilities and limitations allowed him to ask questions that helped refine the operational parameters and identify potential complications before they became serious problems. As the evening progressed, something resembling mutual respect began to develop between them. Morrison acknowledged that his initial behavior had been unprofessional and potentially dangerous, while Sarah recognized that his willingness to learn from the experience and adapt his approach demonstrated the kind of intellectual flexibility that made for effective operational partnerships. The final surprise of the evening came when General Thompson approached them with a proposal that neither had anticipated. A joint task force was being assembled to address emerging terrorist threats that required operators who could work effectively in both traditional military environments and civilian settings where conventional special forces would be too conspicuous. The general suggested that Morrison's experience leading SEAL units and Sarah's expertise in psychological operations and deep cover work might complement each other in ways that could prove valuable for the kinds of complex missions the task force would be undertaking. The proposal required both of them to set aside their ego and focus on professional capabilities rather than personal dynamics. Morrison's response demonstrated that the evening's lessons had been absorbed more thoroughly than anyone might have expected. He expressed genuine interest in learning from Sarah's approach to operational planning and psychological analysis, acknowledging that his own training had focused primarily on direct action rather than the subtle intelligence gathering that had made her so effective. Sarah's acceptance of the partnership possibility was characteristically measured and professional. She indicated that she would be willing to work with Morrison provided that their collaboration focused on complementary capabilities rather than competing approaches to achieving mission objectives. Her willingness to move past the evening's confrontation demonstrated the kind of psychological resilience that had allowed her to survive and excel in hostile environments around the world. The evening concluded with Morrison having gained far more than he had lost through his encounter with Sarah. His assumptions about military hierarchy and capability had been shattered and rebuilt in ways that would make him more effective as both a leader and an operator. The woman who had put him on his back had also opened his eyes to possibilities he had never considered and partnerships that could enhance his own professional development. Sarah's reputation within the intelligence community had been enhanced not just by her physical demonstration but by her gracious handling of the aftermath. Her ability to transform a potentially career-ending incident for Morrison into an opportunity for growth and collaboration showcased exactly the kind of sophisticated thinking that made her valuable for the most sensitive and complex operations. The story of their confrontation would indeed be discussed in classified briefings for years to come, but not simply as an amusing anecdote about an arrogant SEAL getting his comeuppance. Instead, it became a teaching tool about the dangers of assumptions, the value of diverse capabilities within the special operations community, and the importance of being able to recognize and learn from one's mistakes rather than being destroyed by them.